Hi, I'm Dobby, but you can call me Dobbs.
Dun, 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 dun. Dun, 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 dun.
So today I'm going to be showing you guys 5 different books that I read and recommend for AP Literature. So if you don't know already, the third essay question for AP Lit is an open-ended literary argument. And so basically it's going to give you a prompt about like a certain topic, and you have to connect it to a book that you've read of literary merit. So like kind of just a good, usually classics and like books like that. So I took AP Lit my junior year, so I wanted to share with you some of the books that I read and would recommend for the class. The majority of these are easier to read and understand, and the plan is to go through a short summary of the book and then talk about kind of my thoughts and opinions of the book, and then I will share like the major themes that are present in each book, which might be helpful later when you're writing your essays. I will also say that for me personally, it was easier to read a smaller amount of books. Like I think I read maybe 3 or 4 books like during the year for AP Lit specifically, and really like dive deep into analyzing those small amount and being able to write about them for various different topics. That was better for me than reading a ton of books and not really understanding them fully. But it's different for everyone, so I just wanted to share that. So the first book is called Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This book, if you want to read this book, I urge you to not look up any information or read any reviews about it. It's best read without knowing what it's about at all. Like, I will say that. I'll give a really brief summary of it. The story centers around a girl named Kathy. She goes to this boarding school called Hailsham, and it centers around her life and kind of the students that go to Hailsham as well. It centers around their lives from when they're like kids to when they become young adults. And it follows them as they and the readers kind of come to learn the full truth of what Hailsham really is. This book was truly one of those books where I finished reading it and I kind of like felt empty after reading it. The more you think about it, the more interesting Ishiguro's like writing choices become. It's super easy to understand and read. Like it, nothing in it was like confusing to me, like plot wise, or anything like that. There's no overly detailed or like complicated writing. So this was a good book for me. The main themes in this book, I would say, are identity, humanity, death and loss, and hope. So the next book is A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini. I've brought this one because this is The Kite Runner. It's another book by the same author, but this is the only one that I have like the physical copy of. So, but this book is set during the Soviet-Afghan War and then later the Taliban rule over Afghanistan. It first follows this girl named Miriam, and she's a young girl who is sent to marry a man named Rashid when she's only 15 years old. And then later in the book, it kind of switches perspectives and follows a girl named Layla, and her family is struck by tragedy. And soon, Miriam and Layla, their stories kind of begin to intertwine as they both struggle to survive the war and the conditions that they're in. This book was both like captivating and genuinely devastating. I think it was probably the like my favorite book that I read during AP Lit. It was also fairly easy to read, like everything was easy to understand. Although it was significantly longer than most of the books on this list, but it was just such like I recommend this to anyone, not even just for AP Lit. The main themes in this book I would say are resilience, family slash like bonds with other people, loss and grief, war, obviously, and then maybe gender roles, especially like gender roles in other cultures. The next book I have is called A Streetcar Named Desire. This book is actually a play. It follows Blanche Dubois, who loses her wealthy life and she basically has to go live with her sister Stella and her brother-in-law Stanley. Stella and Stanley are married, and she goes to live with them in their small apartment, and it kind of follows Blanche's descent in her mental condition. This book was also easier to read because it was a play, it was mostly dialogue. There were some parts like that were a bit confusing to me when there was like long stretches of dialogue. That was the only parts that were a little bit difficult for me to read, but for the most part, it was easy to understand. There were definitely some powerful messages in this book, but I will say that it was personally the least entertaining for me out of these 5 books. And then I would say the main themes of A Streetcar Named Desire would be like mental instability, gender roles, desire, and fantasy. The next book I have is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I'm pretty sure that most people know the story of this book, but this classic basically tells the story of Dr. Victor Frankenstein, who through this scientific experiment kind of creates this creature who will eventually become his downfall. So this book, it's harder to understand sometimes than the other three, I would say. It's still a great like beginner classic. Like if you're starting to get into classics, this was I think one of the first ones that I read. Especially like the second half of the book, it starts getting more interesting and like you start wanting to read it more, I guess. One thing about this book though, I will say for AP Lit is that it's a very popular novel, so a lot of people might write about it. And what my teacher told me was that when you write about a book that a lot of people write about, like The Great Gatsby, for example, it gives the scorers more to compare your essay to. So like say you write about like The Great Gatsby, so will probably like 50 other people, and there's bound to be a couple of those that wrote it better than the way that you wrote it, so it's like easier to compare versus if you write about books that less people write about it but are still of literary merit, it might be like better for your score. So that's why like Frankenstein is a little bit more popular than the other four books that are on this list. So that's one thing that I just wanted to say to look out for. And then also the main themes of this book I would say are prejudice, humanity, innocence, revenge, and like nature, like human nature. So the last book I have for you guys is The Picture of Dorian Gray. I actually read this book after the class, but I still wanted to include it because I really like it. This book is about this painter called Basil Hallward who becomes obsessed with the beauty of a man called Dorian Gray. And he paints like this portrait of him, which kind of becomes really important later on in the story. But through Basil, Dorian meets this man called Lord Henry, and he becomes really interested in Henry's kind of peculiar theories about like beauty and fulfillment and life in general. So this story, it's actually like a lot more interesting than I just described it. There's like one part of the story that I've seen, like usually people write it in their summaries, like Goodreads on their summary, it has this part about the book, but honestly I read it without knowing that detail, and I thought that it was more interesting because I didn't know that detail beforehand. So I'm not going to say it, but if you're interested, like check out literally any other summary and it will probably say it. But this book it's also harder than the first three books to understand, I will say, but it's still like a very easy read. It's another book that I would say is good for like beginners to classic books. Honestly, like it sucked me in. Like in a couple probably like 5 chapters in, and like it kind of gets crazy, and I got sucked into the book really quickly. So it was really good. And then the main themes of this book I would say are beauty and youth, influence, the purpose of art, and like obsession. So I hope that these recommendations will help you pick out what books you want to read next year if you're taking AP Lit. Good luck next year on your exams. So that will be the end of my video. If you like this video, then like this video and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and happy reading. My last time.